between chapter and national program activity. But as chapters establish themselves as Sierra Club Voice in states, national programs and staff focused on federal policies and federal decision makers. So you had sort of a bifurcation there, and both represented, the club with chapters and groups at the state and local levels. Coordination was eased by the separation of roles and responsibilities. But recently, there's been a convergence and increased alignment. A combination of hostile federal policy involvement and complicated policy of climate change has reduced the separation. And in the 2006 Sierra Summit ensured projects system of channeling national campaign funding to chapters all broke down these walls of separation.
Okay. So moving on to slide 3 with the culture, I think all of you have been around long enough to understand that by nature, chapters are a little idiosyncratic. We have all different cultures, even Delaware working with for New Jersey. We've got different cultures in each of our states, even though we're neighbors. A lot of these are based on history and geography, the local political and cultural environment, and decisions that have been made over the years. So it's really hard to generalize among chapters. We're autonomous. We're the local face of the Sierra Club, and we were actually set up when the country didn't have the internet. We had these things called cars and phones, and unfortunately, cross-country travel was prohibitively expensive, and communication was sporadic. And in fact, at one point, I got to know my mailman pretty well because I got a ton of Sierra Club mail, but that's gone from minimal to almost non-existent these days with the internet. The expectation was that chapters would provide a container for local volunteer leaders to act within, and they were relatively independent, but they were in alignment with Sierra Club mission and policies. State level orientation outside of California is focused on advocacy, often at the state capitol. And this kind of led towards this tendency that's developed towards state level chapter boundaries. There are still probably a few places in the country where there's a little nook of population in the corner of one state that actually might still be a part of the neighboring state just because of the way populations work. So a lot of ownership is held at the local level based on relationships with state-based partners and decision makers and elected officials. And this you can see reflected in our political endorsement process. Like I said earlier, we're aligned with the Sierra Club mission, and we have a compliance orientation. We are looking to deliver the chapters, and the staff work to deliver programs connected to National's strengths, the outings, advocacy lobbying, the endorsements, the electoral process, grassroots engagement, and program is in alignment with national policies. And those policies are framed broadly to allow for interpretation and implementation in these varying circumstances across the many chapters of the club. We're compliance oriented. We still have that C3, C4, but the visibility of chapter work to national was traditionally based on these rules and compliance. Alignment with national policies when establishing local positions, the annual financial reporting, and the political endorsement process, and the required bylaws structure. The chapter and group bylaws are more or less structured in relation to the National Sierra Club's bylaws. So we do have this structure of chapters, groups in many chapters, and often there are sections. Some chapters are now setting up networks, sections being more issue-based or interest-based, and networks being more geographically based. But the relationship of national to chapter is mirrored in the relationship of chapter to group. Similar dynamics and tensions develop between both sets of relationships, although again, the chapter group dynamic varies based on the local culture and history. Looking at identity and role, many chapters hold the identity as the leading advocacy voice within, with full authority to represent the interests of the Sierra Club. And as I said earlier, all of you have built relationships, you're building partnerships, you're exercising your grassroots base, and you're working with or developing your political presence that cements that identity, particularly among peer organizations and in the state's political establishment. This historically created a conflict when national programs operated inside a state and sought to represent the Sierra Club's interests when that work is not coordinated through pre-existing chapter relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, in slide 4, we have some metrics here that might be interesting. And before I get to that, I just want to mention that in Michigan, we've experimented for the last 3 or 4 years with sections and networks. We have an environmental justice section. We have 3 geographic networks that really are groups that were dissolved and then converted into networks, and have had some interesting and good experiences with that. Something, if you haven't tried in your chapters, you may want to get more information about. Running through some of these numbers, basically chapters represent upwards of 17% of the Sierra Club's budget and 20% of the staff. A number of chapter directors has grown in recent years as resources have expanded, and chapters value and recognize these positions are key to growing and becoming more effective. The smaller number next to unstaffed represents recent or soon to happen hiring, as well as a couple of states where a national staff member is partially paid for by the chapter. Numbers in the second column give a higher level sense of the way in which chapters and their constituent groups represent the grassroots power in Sierra Club. The percentage of campaigns aligned with national priorities has increased dramatically in the past decade as National has enlisted chapters through shared project, staff support, and other means. Sierra Club has included support for chapters within each of its departments. And looking toward 2019, 76.84 FTEs equaling $13.650 million will be working in support of chapters. Chapter funding will be almost $7 million, and Sierra Club Foundation funding for chapters will be over $6 million, bringing the total investment to $26.664 million next year. Debbie?
Okay. One flavor of support when we're talking about the FTEs is the way Sierra Club supports governance and program delivery. The support is provided additionally through board-appointed committees and task forces. I've already mentioned Volunteer Leadership and Activism Committee. We love acronyms, so that's called VLAC. There's VATE, Volunteer Accountability Implementation Team, and Scott, if you can unmute, what's CTEST?
Yes. Thanks. Chapter Treasurer Assistance Support Team, a collection of experienced chapter treasurers who liaison with chapters around the country and support their treasurers in doing all the different treasurer stuff.
Okay, thank you. And then we also have the Board Liaison Program, which is currently being reviewed by the board. I'm not going to click the link for this, but there is this wonderful comprehensive directory that's maintained by the Office of Chapter Support, which I think, Scott, if that's been updated recently, we should try to send that out, make sure everyone has a copy of that. We have, as I said, the Office of Chapter Support. Staff is going through a little bit of a change right now with Greg Cassini's retirement, but we also have the Chapter Support Team, which is a mix of volunteers and staff that emphasize team building and leadership skills. we are currently looking for some seasoned volunteers to help us with that. And then Dave already hit the budget estimates, so I won't go through that again.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. So the next slide is, you can see the mission and purpose of the Council Club Leaders, which I started chairing this year. I've been on the executive committee, which is 7 members for the past, this is going on 3 years. CCL, Council Club Leaders, is the formal venue for chapter executive committees to collectively communicate to the board of directors and other club entities. Delegates from chapters are chosen every year by chapter ex-coms from their elected at-large members. And we meet annually in September in conjunction with the annual board of directors meeting. During the year, chapters, through their CCL delegates, propose resolutions to the board, and at the annual meeting, the delegates vote on resolutions that will be proposed to the board. These resolutions can cover virtually any topic of concern to chapters that involve the internal workings of Sierra Club. This year we had 5 resolutions to the board. Some years we've had as many as 15, which gives the board more headaches. But we're trying to be a little more disciplined about how we prioritize these things. This year's topics range from climate and transportation policy, funding equity for small chapters, and a proposal to create something that kind of mirrors the chapter directors representatives, which is a chapter chairs group, which the board is working on right now.
Okay, and in the structure and the bylaws of the Sierra Club, the Council of Club Leaders kind of serves as the Sierra Club's shareholders in a way. Sierra Club is a California corporation, so you need to have that structure in an annual meeting. So the Council of Club Leaders meeting serves to meet that corporate purpose. I think, are all of you aware of the chapter director representatives? I've listed on the screen there the 5 current members of this group, and they serve as liaisons between the group of chapter directors and the Sierra Club Department of Capacities. They were at the board meeting in September, and Jack Darren and others made a presentation, which I believe was the culmination of work that a lot of you did and a lot of your colleagues did over the earlier part of 2018 to bring up some suggestions and ideas and some challenges that you all are facing. But during the year, chapter directors get together at the chapter assembly, which is generally in late spring, and the colloquium, which is usually late December, early November. I'm guessing quite a few might have gone to the colloquium this year. Dave?
So you can see on slide 11, there's various community convenings and communications that really fill this role of linking different constituencies within Sierra Club with one another. A lot of different communications tools. This isn't a comprehensive list. Debbie mentioned the chapter assembly as a convening of chapter chairs originally. That's what it was, and then it was evolved into both directors and chairs. There's going to be an assembly again in 2019, but we don't have a date on that yet. There's a balance, a range of demands and limits that sort of surface, and we hear from people who are overwhelmed and only want essential information. We hear from people in the same roles who didn't get the email and want everything. And that's kind of the nature of communications and why we have so many different options. Communications engagements are challenged just by the idiosyncratic nature of chapters. Specific people tend to expand or contract their roles based on their interests. What's right for one chapter treasurer may be overwhelming or too little for another.
And I guess also the challenge is how much does the chapter director read? And what we've been trying to do is compile some of this information so that you're not getting a flurry of emails, but you might get a monthly email. Just like there's Hitched to keep you up with some of the things that are happening across the Sierra Club, especially in some of the campaigns and work that's happening. There's the chapter bulletin where chapter support staff are pulling things together to let you know about some of the important trainings or information that are out there. The fundraising newsletter goes out about monthly and shares fundraising news and successes of some chapters, which I think might provide the opportunity to get on the phone and call someone up and say, hey, how did you do that? So we just initiated, because of the Council of Club Leaders, a chapter satisfaction survey, which is volunteer-based, and we just had our first year of that. If there's anyone interested in learning about that, let me know. But along with all the communications, there's a lot of change initiatives. So here's a rather long series of bullets. Some of these you may be familiar with, some not so much. Our equity, inclusion, and justice work we've included here. It's something that's kind of one of the bigger umbrellas, some of the bigger focuses that we have over the course of the last couple of years. Chapter staff unionization, that's kind of ongoing work. And resist is what everyone's doing right now with our current administration.
Yeah. And on the next slide, there's three we just wanted to sort of highlight. The Performance Hub, which lays out a specific 5-point approach to cultivating skills and success of volunteer leaders. Has a comprehensive set of tools and links to bring out the best in the volunteers and folks you work with. Whether you're a chapter leader or chapter or group staff, this is a really good resource. Next is Clubhouse and Campfire, which is in transition for volunteers. It's been completed for staff. I think Lindy sent out an email basically saying Clubhouse was going to be retired by April, hopefully, and I'm sure there'll be a retirement party. And Campfire is, if you've used it, you know it's a great new resource. I've found it to be really accessible and easy to use so far, but we'll find out over time. Over the past couple of years, we had developed an intern policy, which was approved by for volunteers and chapters. In total, at the board meeting in November, you should have gotten an email on that. And chapters have until September 1st, 2019 to implement the policy. If you haven't received the policy yet, let Scott or one of us know and we'll make sure you get a copy.
Okay, so bringing up the tail end of our presentation and allowing for conversations, we just wanted to make sure you're aware of the structure, how it evolved. That's allowed for chapters and groups and volunteers to have a rich, self-initiating, and powerful grassroots foundation where we're able to work together to multiply the impact of investment and carry the Sierra Club name forward in its mission in every corner of this country. Chapter staff create visibility, they cultivate volunteer engagement and leadership, you deliver concrete conservation wins, you thwart polluters and bad actors and engage people getting them outside, you elect pro-environmental candidates to both state and local offices, and you're building wide-range partnerships with allies and decision makers, and that's all before you have a cup of coffee in the morning. So a lot of good work is happening out there. And you as chapter directors have the ability and the strength to build chapters by engaging the local volunteers on both local, state, and national issues. You're actually serving as a form of a communications hub, trying to bring down what's happening here and sharing it with your leaders and also your volunteers. You also serve as a connector to national staff programs and campaigns, hopefully gleaning what opportunities and funding might be available for the specific programs and activities your chapter has going on. You can also serve as a connector through your chapter representatives to address and bring local issues or situations that you see up as they arise. But you're also there to help identify where there's some challenges with some of your volunteers and trying to address local problems more locally. We're trying to give you the resources needed with the performance habit and some other things and some training to help identify and to address those issues. So I think I'm just going to leave it for that at that and see what questions people have. Scott?
Yeah, thank you both very much for the presentation. Hopefully everybody's able to follow along with the slides, but we will post those slides as we normally do. I think our recording is working, so that will be posted as well for y'all and other folks. But in the meantime, conversation, questions, thoughts folks have. And I again want to remind y'all that we've got two of our most experienced and savvy volunteer leaders on the phone, and they've both done a lot of work at the chapter level. So if you've got questions about the nature of the relationship that you have with your executive committee members, or how to think about the role of volunteer leadership in the Sierra Club versus maybe past experience, this is a great couple of folks to ask those questions of.
Yeah, I guess this is Kate, David and Debbie. I'm really glad to have this, and yet it is completely different from what most of our sort of seminars have been on this so far, and not what I was expecting at all. I've of course been a chapter director for a little while now, for 2.5 years. So a lot of this I had to sort of learn the hard way. And I'm really glad that we now have the Office of Chapter Support doing these seminars for new directors, and many of my colleagues who are newer may have learned a lot, whereas this was more of like a sort of a summary and recap for me. I guess what I was really interested in is how do you all function? How does the Council of Club Leaders function? How does the board function? Are there ways in which you see the chapters, either volunteers or directors, sort of interacting at all? At this point, I don't really know much of anything about what you all do. I just know that when there are policies that are decided on, we have to follow them. And so I think maybe that is where I would start, if you don't mind.
You want to start with CCL, David?
Sure. Well, like a lot of things at Sierra Club, CCL is idiosyncratic over time. What CCL in my experience has been, and just about everyone I've met in volunteer leadership at the national level has sort of touched CCL as a delegate or on the executive committee or chaired it at one point, is 90% of the work of the body of delegates, who are selected usually in January by executive committees, takes place at the annual meeting and expresses itself through resolutions. I would say that is the bulk of the work of the Council of Club Leaders up to that point. In between that time, 7 people and largely the chair fill different roles as liaisons with the board of directors and other entities. And we have people who, for example, are serve on Debbie's committee, who from the executive committee, who bring information back to us. And if we're doing our job, we're sharing that information with chapters through their delegates, and the same with the board. In between that time, things happen. Like, for example, the intern policy was developed for national staff. There was a lot of pushback at the chapter level, and so through the CCL, working with the board and the existing intern policy task force, we brought more chapter representation to the task force and put a pause on it until we had a policy that was more in alignment with chapters. So some of it is, responsive to things that happen during the year. And then there's the structure that produces resolutions to the board. And then through the year, we communicate with various entities within the club about the status of implementing those resolutions. And, I don't know if that addresses specifically what you were asking about CCL, but I'd be happy to address any other specific issues about that.
Yeah, I think that helps a lot. I guess when there are things that are coming out from the National Sierra Club, what is the appropriate avenue, I guess, to connect with CCL? Because I guess the impression that I get is that the reason that there's a close relationship there is because of the fact that historically chapters were all volunteer led. And now, of course, has been this shift, and many of our chapters have staff, and those of us who are directors obviously are staff. So is it appropriate for the chair of our XCOM to pass along concerns to you all? Or is it appropriate for us to be involved in that as staff in any way? Or what would your recommendation be?
Well, I think ideally what you would have in your chapter is a delegate to the Council Club leaders from the XCOM. That is your primary communications through the CCL. I think we had delegates from virtually every chapter last year. Some years it waxes and wanes, but we have a pretty good representation. And that's, I would say, the primary thing. There's nothing that prevents you as a state director or a chapter chair from reaching out directly to me as chair of the CCL, XCOM, with anything at all that I know of. But traditionally, the communications has been up through your CCL delegate. And sometimes, most of these, for example, let's say that your chapter has a particular issue that it wants to lift up about a conservation policy internally, or some other governance issue, or the way things are happening in the club that you think could be improved. You take that to your XCOM. Your XCOM passes a resolution. Your delegate then takes that through the Council Club leaders process. It's discussed, debated, and then voted on. And then once it's adopted by the CCL, it no longer is a resolution, a request to the board from your chapter, but rather it carries the weight of all the chapters throughout the country to the board. And then we have a formal process where the board receives this at the annual meeting, and then the president assigns different entities within the club responsibility for considering implementation. And we try to maintain some communications through the years as that evolves.
And Julia, another particular thing about the council is that it also has a budget to support most of the travel for your council delegate from your chapter. So you don't have to allocate any money, I don't think, in the chapter budget for the travel of the delegate. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And on the board side, to get to other parts of your question, elections happen in March through April. There are 15 members of the board. 5 new board members are seated each May. The board meets 4 times a year, physically face-to-face, and in those non-meeting months, we have phone calls. We receive the resolutions from the council. We receive recommendations or resolutions from the chapter chair representatives. We are involved with various committees. Each of us serves on at least one committee, board committee, and I'm chairing the volunteer leadership and activism committee. There's the finance committee, better called FinCom, that works on the budget and a lot of risk-based issues. There is the analysis. What is it? I'm drawing a blank. There's a planning and evaluation board advisory committee, and there's a conservation policies committee. And there might be 1 or 2 others, but I wanted to kind of stick for a minute on the conservation policies end of things. If a policy has been noted that it's either a new one's needed or one needs to be updated, a team is usually formed of staff and volunteers who will establish a process and work with making those changes, working with folks that are really knowledgeable on that particular issue. Often they will send out surveys or make phone calls or have conference calls trying to gather some information and feedback. And then during the course of the process, there's a review period. Once the final draft is presented to the board will move to adopt, but they'll put a 60-day comment period out before final adoption to make sure there isn't anything further that bubbles to the top. So one of your questions was that you have policies to follow, but you're really not quite sure how they came to be. There are people in the club who have expertise on anchors when you're hiking or mountain climbing, all the way through to waste and energy issues. And it's these experts who have been pulled together to try to write some of these policies that provide guidance for you and the volunteers when they're out there fighting those issues. From the board view, we try to get out to various meetings. Our board chair, Lauren Blackford, has been traveling and visiting chapters as they have special events. Sometimes she'll be a speaker to help goose your ticket sales because the board chair is coming. But we try to get out and attend meetings, talk to chapter leaders. I think each of us has a network that we've developed over the course of our time working with the Sierra Club. And if something comes up and I know somebody that's been working on that, I'll reach out and say, hey, help me understand this or tell me more about this. But those of us that have come up through the chapter ranks, I think still cling to and depend on a lot of the connections we made. And we seek to meet more people to try to understand what's going on out there and help us to think about and or vote on something. So that's my 2 cents. Did that get at your question fully? Oh, she's on mute. Okay.
We can go ahead. Other folks with questions for David and Debbie? We can make this a really quick call, a really short discussion, but this is a great chance, folks, if y'all have any questions about. I know for some people coming into the organization for the first time, they have a different experience with what volunteerism means in a context like Nature Conservancy or something like that. The role of a volunteer leader can be a little baffling inside of the Sierra Club. So if you have any questions about that, that would be great, or anything else about the board or council or other national volunteer entities.
So Kate got logged off and her mic's not working.
Yeah, if you've got a follow-up, just throw it in the chat box, Kate. We can follow up as well.
Well, Scott, one of the things you just mentioned was this difference between like Nature Conservancy and their board and the state boards versus the Sierra Club. I was staff with the Nature Conservancy as a fundraiser. And for me, they're two totally distinct ways of working. And what excites me about the Sierra Club is that the chapter staff particularly are able to manage people who are members that are suddenly wanting to get active, or people that, because of elections or whatever, they want to find a way to take action and to help fix things. So you're at this incredible pivot point where you can engage these folks. If you're able to develop a nice structure of volunteer leaders, you can find out what these new people have as an interest, and then introduce them to the membership chair if they want to bake brownies and have help with setting up meetings, or if they have a fundraising expertise, maybe they're a grant writer, you can plug them in with your fundraising committee. If you're lucky enough to get a scientist who really loves chemistry and they know about air, that might help you if you're working with some power plant issues or air pollution issues. But you're at the central pivot point where some of your time and your staff's time, if you're lucky to have staff, can be used to engage these people, and you help to multiply the efforts of the chapter by putting these people to work. And the Nature Conservancy, it's more of a attend meetings type of thing. They aren't as engaged. And Sierra Club, it's all about the volunteers. Board is a working board.
David, Debbie, any concluding thoughts? And we'll give folks one more chance to ask questions before we wrap up. But if y'all have any wrap-up thoughts right now, we could end this before the top of the hour.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a pitch to everybody on the call that, your ex-coms will pick your CCL delegate in January. And just to, consider if there's a particular volunteer leader who's an at-large member of your ex-com, who's particularly those who may have been on the ex-com for a while and are high performing, who are looking for a new challenge, because we're really not in the business of trying to poach leadership, but someone who maybe might be recruited eventually after being on delegate for a year or so to the executive committee of the CCL, which meets monthly. I just encourage everyone to be thinking about the Council Club leaders and that as you're talking to your chapter chairs and planning for next year.
Okay, and to kind of segue off of something David said, as you meet and get to know all of your volunteers, if you have some really effective volunteers who are segueing off a leadership role, they're looking for newer pastures to get involved. There's a lot of national teams and committees who are looking for some new fresh faces and new ideas. We need to diversify and freshen up the ideas that are and the energy that's on a lot of national committees and things. So like David said, we don't like to poach, but it would be great if you are working with someone you think they're still interested in getting involved with the Sierra Club, but their chapter time has kind of come to an end. If you suggest that they might want to look into a national team or committee, David or I will be happy to try to help orient them and plug them in. There's also something called Volunteer Connections, which is a place on the web where they can go to find about volunteer activities, but it's also a place where your chapter can post and promote opportunities within your own chapter. And then one last thing, if you were looking to read a couple of these various communications that come out, I think the chapter bulletin is probably the thing that I'd put at the top of my list to read. I would also work with your executive team on the XCOM on the chapter to make sure they're going to be receiving the appropriate communication. If they're a fundraiser, get the fundraising newsletter, and so on. So I'm seeing Kate is saying, is there more info? Wait a minute, gotta go to chat. Is there more info about CCL or the board posted online? Okay, so Scott's saying clubvolunteer.org. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, and on Campfire, there's a Council of Club Leaders page with information on it.
Yeah, I want to be clear. Clubvolunteer.org is the volunteer connection that Debbie referred to earlier. More information about the board or CCL, the best place to go is to Campfire. I would encourage you also to reach out directly to David or Debbie with questions, or of course I'm always happy to take them as well.
Yeah, I will let you know that the volunteer stuff is still getting populated up on Campfire. So there's more going up each week.
Any final questions before we wrap up today, folks? Thank you, David and Debbie, for leading on our final orientation call. We might do these orientations again at some point in the future, but for now we're going to maintain these recordings and PowerPoints for folks to refer to. If any of you get questions from your peers that you think might have been answered in one of these webinars, I would encourage y'all to point them to the spreadsheet. I'm going to hopefully also get that information posted on Campfire early in the new year. In the meantime, thanks to everybody and have a wonderful holiday break.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great break. Thanks.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.